Hi, guys. Welcome back to Health Decoded. I'm excited for today's conversation. I hope you guys like it as much as I do. Today, we're talking about estrogen, how one hormone shapes the female body. We're going to dive in deep. I do want to make the preface men do have estrogen in their bodies as well. Our main focus today is on the female body because it is really one of the primary hormones in the female body. It affects so much and really determines what makes our body so much more different than a man's. I will get into testosterone in another episode, but today we're talking all about estrogen. So I did want to make that disclaimer. I also want to um, go ahead and clarify, just because I want to be thorough. Whenever I talk about female or woman, if I say either of those, I mean XX chromosome. And when I say man or male, I mean XY. I don't want to get the conversation confused about gender or sex. We're talking about sex when we talk about science. So when I'm talking about estrogen or rather female and women today, I'm talking about XX chromosome. Okay. So diving in, um, estrogen affects pretty much every system in the female body. It's pretty amazing at the things that it affects and how it helps. Um, I I want you to think of it as not just a female hormone tied to your period. Think of it as a full body manager. It affects and communicates with all the different systems in our body. It has a very protective effect, as you will see as we talk through these different systems. Um, it affects heart, brain, bone, muscles, skin, tissues as you age over time. And also, as we talk about this, I'm going to definitely make notes about menopause and like the decline of estrogen with these different systems so that you can kind of start to see and make the connection as to how that affects us and the difference between your reproductive years and then the non reproductive years. So, hopefully, by the end of this episode, you'll understand not just what estrogen does, but why it matters for everyday female health, fitness, and longevity. So, starting with where it comes from and how it works, I love a why question. Estrogen is produced from three sources. So, we have the ovaries, adrenal glands, which sit on top of the kidneys, and then fat tissue. So, ovaries is primary for reproductive years. Premenopausal women, that's the main source of where you're getting your estrogen from. And then as it declines in menopausal women, the adrenal glands and fat tissue contribute small amounts. And this is why men do also have certain amounts of estrogen in the bodies, because there is natural amounts of estrogen in fat tissue and coming from the adrenal glands that sit on top of your kidneys. So then after menopause in the female body, estrogen, the main source turns from the fat tissue from there. So we have three types of estrogen. So it's actually a group of hormones. So we have estradiol, which is common in reproductive years, estrone, which is more common after menopause, and then estriol, which is more common in pregnancy specifically. So, what makes estrogen so powerful is the way it works on a cellular level. It binds to estrogen receptors, which are present throughout the whole body, but think of them as like tiny switches. So, when the estrogen connects and attaches to those receptors, it flips those switches and it tells those specific cells, wherever it attached, brain, bone, muscle, on how to behave. So, whether it's growing or repairing or communicating with other cells, it's binding to these different receptors and telling it what to do. And this can explain why, well, this explains the widespread influence that estrogen has and how the level changes can feel so dramatic. So, diving into our first system with estrogen is the brain. Estrogen acts like a mood and focus enhancer. It supports the production of serotonin, which is your happy chemical, and dopamine, which is your motivation and your reward chemical. It also improves cognitive function, memory, verbal skills, and it has a neuroprotective effect, helping neurons from stress and damage. So we're going to see this theme a lot with all the systems. In estrogen protects the system in a certain way, and it helps it to function more effectively. So when estrogen is active in the brain, it's not just affecting the mood on the surface, it's actually changing how the neurons communicate with each other. Estrogen increases the synaptic plasticity, which is your brain's ability to form and strengthen connections. That's one reason why learning verbal fluency and memory often feel sharper when estrogen is stable. So when we have these changes occur when estrogen drops, maybe you're going to notice some brain fog or some mentation decrease, some memory loss, things like that. When estrogen is active in the brain, it's not just affecting mood on the surface, it's actually changing how neurons communicate with each other. So, estrogen increases synaptic plasticity, which is the brain's ability to form and strengthen connections. That's one reason why, like, learning, verbal fluency, and memory often feel sharper when estrogen is stable and at a good level. Estrogen also helps regulate neurotransmitter systems. It increases the availability of serotonin and influencing both its production on how it stays active in the brain and how long. It enhances dopamine signaling, which supports motivation, reward, focus. There's this protective side, as I've mentioned, to estrogen in the brain. It improves blood flow throughout the brain tissue, and it helps the mitochondria, which is the cell's energy producers, work more efficiently. So, estrogen reduces oxidative stress and inflammation in neural tissue, neural being brain tissue, which helps protect neurons from damage over time. And so this goes to show, like, when we have these estrogen levels change or it'll drop with menstruation or menopause or whatever the transition is, brain energy metabolism becomes less efficient. So essentially, brain fog, fatigue, memory loss, these different kinds of symptoms are essentially side effects of this estrogen drop. So these aren't just in your head symptoms, they're real nervous system. Your nervous system is responding to hormonal signals and changes, and that's okay. Moving on through to the reproductive system, estrogen tells the uterus to grow and maintain its lining and supports healthy vaginal tissue and lubrication. When we talk about estrogen on the reproductive system, it's important to remember that it's not just turning reproduction on or off, it's coordinating timing, tissue health, and communication between these different organs. So, in the uterus, estrogen stimulates the growth and thickening of the endometrial lining in the uterus. It does this by increasing cell growth and blood vessel formation, making sure that the lining is well supplied with oxygen and nutrients. I'll get into this in the specific menstruation episode, but essentially when it's time for menstruation happens because the baby wasn't formed, right? So estrogen's feeding the uterus, feeding the system, helping it grow so that can be really nutrient dense, so that if a baby or a fetus does grow in that environment, it has all that it needs to grow. So then when it doesn't do that, it has to shed. So again, estrogen helps to build all of that formation. This process is tightly regulated because estrogen is essentially, again, preparing the uterus to be responsive for said baby or to other hormones later in the cycle. Because women operate on a 28-day cycle, it has to keep continuing because Mother Nature doesn't give free lunches and evolution always wants to continue. Estrogen also affects the cervix and vaginal tissue, so it increases blood flow, supports tissue elasticity, and maintains moisture by influencing the production of glycogen in these vaginal cells. Let me backtrack. That glycogen helps to support healthy bacteria in that area, which then in turn helps to protect against infection. When estrogen levels drop, this tissue can become thinner, less elastic, and more prone to irritation, which explains dryness and discomfort, or even increased infection risk that may occur in later years. Um, Estrogen in the ovaries, it participates in a feedback loop with the brain. It communicates with the hypothalamus and pituitary gland to regulate follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. This feedback loop is what creates the menstrual cycle and helps keep it coordinated. When estrogen becomes irregular, such as during perimenopause, ovulation starts to become unpredictable. And so cycles may shorten, they may lengthen, symptoms can feel really intense. It just becomes dysregulated because your estrogen levels are changing so much. And that's essentially the person in command saying this is how this is supposed to go. And that's getting dysregulated. Estrogen also affects reproductive smooth muscle and pelvic floor, like connective tissue. This helps to maintain tone and elasticity. So, again, when estrogen declines, this can influence the pelvic floor function over time. So, we can see a decrease in the tone, and it can lead to some other problems like even urinary problems. So, overall, reproductive health with estrogen, it isn't just about fertility. It's about maintaining tissue health, signaling accuracy with the cycle and coordinating all of that, and also the structural integrity of all these musculature down there. Moving on to bone health. Estrogen is a bone protector. Surprise, surprise. It slows the breakdown of bone and helps maintain bone density. So there's two types of cells in bones: osteoclasts, which break down the bone, and osteoblasts, which help build it back up. So estrogen helps to regulate that. It keeps osteoclast, the breakdown activity, reduced and or rather in check, and then prevents excessive bone breakdown with that. When estrogen levels fall, this is when we start to see an increase. So, like in menopause years, estrogen level falls, and we start to see an increase in bone breakdown or osteoporosis or degenerative diseases in the skeletal system. And this is because the osteoclast, the breakdown cycle becomes more active and the bone breakdown essentially starts to speed up. So at the same time, the osteoblast or buildup cell, that activity doesn't increase enough to compensate. And so this leads to a net loss of bone density. And you'll even see people shrink as a result of this. So this imbalance is why bone loss accelerates so rapidly after menopause. Estrogen also influences how bones respond to mechanical stress. It helps bone cells sense load and strain. And so this is why strength training, resistance training, lifting weights, weight bearing, all that kind of stuff, it's so effective even in menopause and in older age at preserving bone even when the estrogen is already lower. So without estrogen, bones become less responsive, and it makes intentional strength training even more important. Moving on to cardiovascular health with estrogen. Estrogen supports cardiovascular function. I've got three main ways I'm going to talk about. Helps blood vessels remain flexible, promotes healthy cholesterol levels, and reduces inflammation. So, this partly explains why premenopausal women generally have lower rates of heart disease than men of the same age, but also why when women have cardiac issues, it presents so much more differently than in men. And we can talk about that in a cardiac episode. But again, estrogen has a very protective effect over all of these different systems, and it helps to regulate these things I'm about to talk about. But as such, it causes the presentation when those problems and symptoms do arise to be different. So, one of estrogen's biggest jobs is helping blood vessels to stay flexible. So, healthy blood vessels aren't rigid. We don't want them to be rigid and hard. We want them to be flexible. We want them to expand because blood flows through them, and we don't want things to get stuck or lodged in a blood vessel. So estrogen supports that by increasing something called nitric oxide, which tells blood vessels to relax. So it promotes that elasticity. When vessels can widen easily, blood flows more smoothly and blood pressure stays lower. The heart doesn't have to work as hard to pump blood throughout the body. So again, estrogen levels drop, vessels become stiffer, blood pressure can start to go up, and vascular strain can actually increase. Okay. Moving into cholesterol, we're still in cardiovascular health. Estrogen, so we have two different cholesterol that we want to talk about. We have LDL, which is the bad cholesterol, and HDL, which is the good cholesterol. So estrogen helps to keep this in check. So it keeps the good cholesterol up, which helps to clear the bloodstream, and it helps keep the bad cholesterol, the LDL, down. Because if that goes up, we start to see more clots and plaque formation. So this balance matters because cholesterol buildup in arteries is one of the key drivers of heart disease. So again, I'll cover that in the heart disease episode, but just know estrogen helps with that. So again, estrogen declines, that balance often shifts in the wrong direction, and plaque buildup can be more common in older age because of that. Another important role with estrogen in the cardiovascular system is inflammation inside the blood vessels. A lot of people think inflammation is something that you feel, like swelling or pain, and it is, but in the arteries and the vessels, it's silent and it can be really deadly. So, estrogen has an anti inflammatory effect that helps protect the lining of the blood vessels and keeps the plaque more stable. So, when estrogen is lower, inflammation becomes harder to regulate, and that can increase the risk of artery damage and cardiovascular events. But ultimately, all of this helps to explain a pattern that we see across the lifespan. Before menopause, estrogen offers a layer of protection. And so things like heart disease and high cholesterol are lower. And then after these estrogen levels fall, that protection fades and cardiovascular risks rise, not just because of aging, but because of this natural hormonal decrease. So when we talk about estrogen, it's important to know that it keeps, estrogen in the cardiovascular system. It's important to know that it helps keep blood vessels flexible, cholesterol balanced, and inflammation under control. Okay. Okay. This is one of my favorite topics to talk about with estrogen, but it's the muscular system, muscle strength and exercise. There seems to be a preconceived notion that muscle is masculine, and I just don't subscribe to that. And we'll talk about why. I don't think people really realize how much estrogen plays such a key role in muscle and strength training. It supports muscle repair, it supports glycogen storage, so energy for workouts. It supports ligament and tendon health, which reduces your injury risk, and in that reduces exercise induced muscle damage. Okay. So ladies, if you do go to the gym and you lift weights, if you've ever lifted with the male persuasion, whether it be a boyfriend or a friend or whatever, and you're doing the same workout, have you ever noticed, and if you haven't, go do it again and see if you notice. Have you noticed that your recovery time is less than his, or that you can actually do more than he can do? And that's not to say that women are better than men or women do more than men, but it's just really interesting to examine the differences in how women work out and how men work out and how different workouts affect us, because the same program is not going to achieve the same results. So men tend to be more upper body based and women tend to be more lower body based, but I'm talking just as a whole. So if we did the same exercise, a woman is going to recover quicker. So let's say the guy has to rest for 60 seconds before the next set, and the girl only has to rest for 40. and she's ready to go. She rested, she breathed, she sat there and waited, and she's ready to go sooner than he is. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just your estrogen is in there and it says, I'm ready to go. I've recovered your muscle. Let's do it again. Also, women tend to be able to do more sets. So men tend to lift heavier. So I'm not denying that. Men lift heavier, and that's because of the amount of testosterone. That's not to say that women can't lift heavy. We should lift heavy. Go do it. But men tend to lift more weight. Women can lift more amounts, if that makes sense. So let's say for like a lower body training day, a woman could do 6 sets, or like 6 different exercises rather, and the guys would be dead after like 4. That's pretty common feedback that I've received or heard from other people comparing exercises and things like that. And part of that is because I'm comparing a leg day from men to women, but just in general, yes. So too long, don't read. Estrogen supports muscle repair, the glycogen storage, and it reduces your injury risk and therefore your recovery time, or increases your recovery time because of that. Okay. So it doesn't mean that strength training is less effective. It's just that we just have to do it differently, and that's okay. Moving on through weight metabolism and fat distribution. Estrogen influences how your body stores and uses energy. It promotes fat storage in hips and thighs rather than in your belly. So it's really common for women to have a lower fat distribution on their body. And it helps to regulate insulin sensitivity and then your appetite cues. So estrogen plays a central role in your metabolic regulation, especially how the body handles glucose and fat. In muscle and liver tissue, estrogen improves insulin sensitivity, so it helps glucose move efficiently out of the bloodstream and into cells where it can be used for energy, kind of referencing back to the muscles a little bit. This supports stable blood sugar and efficient energy production. It also influences fat cell behavior, so it regulates enzymes involved in fat storage and fat breakdown and helps control where fat is preferentially stored. With adequate estrogen, fat is more likely to be stored in subcutaneous areas like the hips and the thighs. So one thing that I have learned that I think is really, really interesting, there's a specific cell so when we talk about this fat distribution in the hips, glutes, and that upper thigh region that's really common in females for like the female look, it's called gluteofemoral fat, and it's just a location. But there's specific cells in this area that are not found in, I don't think, any other area of the body. I think they maybe found small amounts, maybe in the breast tissue or in the back of the arms, I forget, but it's pretty distinctly in this gluteofemoral area. And these cells are specific in the 3rd trimester of pregnancy. It goes and creates the baby's retinas, so the eyes and the brains. And you can't find these cells anywhere else. And I think that's so fascinating because it really speaks to, so like when you're pregnant and you see your butt and your thighs are growing, ladies, if you're pregnant, this is why. It's literally your baby making butt. So, I sit here and I do my own strength training and my weight loss training, and that's the one area that doesn't want to leave, is that lower body area. So the feminine experience, that's all I'll say. So I'm just saying it's fairly normal for that weight to be distributed into that area. I also wanted to speak, this is a good time to speak about this. Women naturally sit at higher body fat percentages than men do. Men can sit at like 5 or 6% and they're chilling. I'm not saying that's easy, but it's different compared to a woman. I think it's about 10% is the cutoff of when you start to experience amenorrhea, which is lack of period. And so think about it. If estrogen is coming from the fat cells and you lose your fat cells, you lose your estrogen. So therefore you lose that cycle regulation that we were talking about. So not only is it it's not impossible. I'm not saying women can't get down to lower body fat percentages. It's just more common for us to sit at a body fat percentage that is higher and that be more healthy. So 15% or 20% is still perfectly fit and healthy. And it's just because of not only how it's distributed, but again, the fact that we have estrogen and the fact that we have wombs. So moving into skin, hair, and joints with estrogen. In the skin, estrogen directly stimulates fibroblasts, the cells responsible for producing collagen, elastin, and hyaluronic acid. For all of my skincare girlies, listen up. These components give skin its thickness, elasticity, and ability to retain moisture. So estrogen helps maintain this skin barrier by promoting lipid production in the outer skin layers. It improves blood flow to the skin, which supports nutrient delivery and wound healing. And it also helps to regulate inflammation in skin tissue, which reduces the breakdown of collagen over time. So, when you age, as estrogen declines, these protective measures decrease. So, you'll see gravity take effect, you'll see some wrinkles, and just generally almost more of a dullness in a way, because that hyaluronic acid, that moisture retaining protective quality, is reducing as well. In connective tissue and joints, estrogen influences the composition of cartilage and the production of synovial fluid, which helps joints to move more smoothly. So the synovial fluid sits between the joints because you don't want bone on bone. That would not be fun. So you have and I could talk about this in another episode, you have the sacs of fluid that help to protect the bones, so that they're not rubbing on each other. So the estrogen helps to feed that synovial fluid to help keep it moisturized, essentially, and hydrated, and help your joints move smoothly. So again, estrogen levels drop, that decreases, and you can see an increase in joint stiffness and discomfort, creakiness, all that fun stuff. That kind of references back a little bit to the skeletal system with osteoporosis too, that we talked about. Hair follicles are also super sensitive to estrogen. Estrogen helps prolong the growth phase of the hair cycle. When estrogen declines, hair may spend less time in the growth phase and more time in the shedding phase. And this doesn't just pertain to menopause. As you get older, I've got friends in their 30s and they're starting to experience hair loss because they're getting older and they don't have the same estrogen levels as they did in their 20s. And so hair is naturally starting to fall out more, or thinning in general, instead of growing. This also speaks to during pregnancy, you have such a massive increase in estrogen with the estriol that we talked about. And that's why women typically, when they're pregnant, their hair just looks so absolutely voluminous and gorgeous, because they have those large amounts of estrogen that are getting pumped in and pumped out of their hair, or through, I should say. Estrogen and longevity. Estrogen is linked to cellular protection. So it's got antioxidant effects. It protects blood vessels and neurons, and it reduces chronic inflammation. So all these things we've talked about, again, estrogen is a protector. So when we talk about longevity, estrogen's role becomes more subtle, but it supports longevity not by preventing aging, but by slowing the processes that accelerate cellular damage over time. At the cellular level, estrogen acts as an antioxidant, as I said. It helps reduce oxidative stress, which is the damage caused by free radicals during normal metabolism. Oxidative stress contributes to aging, inflammation, chronic disease. So, estrogen's ability to limit this has long-term protective effects. And this is why when we see the estrogen levels decrease in menopause, we start to see the aging increase much more. Estrogen helps to regulate inflammation throughout the body. So, chronic low grade inflammation is a major driver of aging and age related diseases, including cardiovascular disease, metabolic dysfunction. We talked about bone health. Estrogen modulates immune signaling so that inflammation is used when needed, but not left switch on constantly. Another key longevity mechanism in estrogen is estrogen's effect on mitochondria. Again, the powerhouse of the cell. Estrogen helps mitochondria function more efficiently, meaning cells produce energy with less waste and less damage. So, efficient energy production supports organ function over decades, especially in energy demanding tissues like the brain, the heart, and muscles. Estrogen also protects blood vessels by supporting the endothelial lining, so the lining of the vessels. It supports the function, as we talked about with the flexibility of it earlier. So it helps maintain healthy circulation and nutrient delivery to tissues. Good circulation is foundational for longevity because every organ depends on adequate blood flow to repair and regenerate. At the genetic level, estrogen influences gene expression related to cell repair, stress response, and survival pathways. This doesn't stop aging, but it improves the cell's ability to adapt and recover. These cumulative effects help explain why women tend to have lower rates of certain chronic diseases earlier in life and also live longer than average than their male counterparts. It's important to understand that when estrogen declines, these protective systems don't disappear, they just lose one layer of support. And that's why lifestyle factors like resistance training, cardiovascular fitness, nutrition, sleep, stress management, these all become increasingly powerful tools for healthy aging. So, too long don't read version, putting it all together. Estrogen is far more than a reproductive hormone. It's a full body regulator and protector affecting all systems in the body: brain and mood and mentation, muscle strength and recovery, heart health, bone health, metabolism. Understanding estrogen helps explain why your body feels different and maybe works a little differently at different times of the month and also different stages of life, but also how lifestyle can really interact with your hormone levels and how it can help to change things. So, key takeaways: estrogen binds to receptors in nearly every organ system. It helps to guide in growth, repair, energy use, and mood. Protective: estrogen has a very high protective quality in all of these organ systems. And declining estrogen contributes to a lot of the different changes that women see in menopause and in aging. But ultimately, knowledge is power. Understanding estrogen helps you plan out your lifestyle, your workouts, your nutrition, your self care. Planning your lifestyle out around your hormonal rhythms can really help you to create the healthiest and happiest life that you can have. And that's ultimately what I want. So, if today's episode helped you understand estrogen more in a whole body context, let me know in the comments. If you have any questions, I'd love to hear them, or share it with somebody who needs it. And I'll see you guys next time. Thanks for listening.